First Amendment, free speech, free press, assembly, and petition. These are fundamentals of democracy necessary to allow for criticism of government, since the government is given authority from the people, and in a democracy, the people are supposed to be able to say what they feel about the government, and then the government should respond. Freedom of expression. The First Amendment plainly forbids the national government from limiting freedom of expression. Controversy exists, however, whether freedom of expression is absolute. When and under which circumstances is it okay to limit expression? So freedom of expression, as necessary as it is for a democracy and how it is important for people to have freedom of speech and press, the Supreme Court has had to decide when is it okay to limit and why is it okay to limit some people's speech. Prior restraint. Prior restraint is probably what you best know as censorship. When the government restrains or keeps something from being published or said before it is able to be published or said. So prior means before, restraint means the government is keeping it from becoming public. Okay. In the case of Neer versus Minnesota, some prior restraint is tolerated. So in 1931, a high school newspaper made it to the Supreme Court because the high school newspaper was censored during times of war, and that is typically okay. So with Neer versus Minnesota, the precedent was set that it is okay for the government to prevent some information from coming out, especially in times of war. It's really about maintaining public order. In Schenck versus the United States, there was a huge conflict between the press and the government. Okay, so in this case, it was 1919. The Supreme Court declared that government could limit speech if it provokes a clear and present danger of substantive evils. So in this case, Schenck was encouraging people to burn their draft cards for World War I, and he was arrested. And he said it was a violation of his freedom of speech because his encouragement of people to burn their draft cards was all that was free speech. The people didn't have to listen to him. But the Supreme Court said in times of war, your speech had irrevocable dangers. What you were doing was putting the United States at clear and present danger or risk by encouraging people to burn draft cards. So the Supreme Court in that case equated free speech to be limited in cases of, or equated free speech in Schenck's case of yelling fire in a crowded theater. If you yell fire in a crowded theater, then that's going to cause people to rush out of the theater, possibly trampling people or hurting people, and that's creating a clear and present danger. Even though burning the draft card wasn't exactly yelling fire in a crowded theater, they equated the two to that. So that established the clear and present danger test. The government can limit speech if it puts people in danger. The Smith Act in 1940 prevented the advocacy of violent overthrow of the government in the United States. So early in our history, it was really clear that we were willing to limit speech if that meant protecting public order and maintaining national security. But there have been changes since the 1960s. And this has resulted in narrow interpretations of the Smith Act. Today, you can call for the overthrow of the government in an abstract way and not have to worry about any repercussions. So since then, like, I could say, I hate the government, down with the government, your biggest enemy is the government, forget the United States. But unless I can really prove that I have the means of overthrowing the government, there really can't be any repercussions against that speech. So you can protest. Now, of course, the political changes came since Watergate and the Vietnam War, specifically protests surrounding the Vietnam War, and also the Civil Rights Movement. Today we have what we call a preferred doctrine test, where almost all freedoms of speech are preferred. Whether we like it or not, the Supreme Court prefers to protect freedom of speech as almost absolute as possible. Libel and slander. The definition of libel or slander is written or spoken statements that intentionally print false or say false information that defames the character of a person. Libel is the literature or the written slandering of somebody's character that intends to hurt a person, and slander is the spoken defamation of somebody's character that intends to hurt the person. Slander is more difficult to prove because you end up in a he said, she said situation since slander is spoken. Libel is easier to prove since it's written down for public record. Okay. We've had a rich tradition in this country of protecting people who print things about people, specifically public figures. In the Peter Singer trial before the American Revolution, American colonists had the ability to print something as long as it was true. You could expose a public figure, and in this case, you can expose a British government official and say bad things about him as long as it is true. So you can throw a government official under the bus, but the key is you can't be lying about what you're saying. We took a little turn for the worse during the Adams administration, our second president, Adams, when Adams allowed and pursued the prosecution of people who defamed public officials. But that was considered one of our low points in freedom of speech, and as soon as Jefferson got into office, everybody who was arrested under the Sedition Act was pardoned. Really, the more modern case that sets a standard for libel and slander is New York Times versus Sullivan, as depicted in this cartoon here. Public figures are bound by a higher standard. If you are a public figure, you have to understand that it is the media's job as a watchdog through investigative journalism to uphold you to an honest and ethical standard. Okay, so in this case, in New York Times versus Sullivan, hold on, it's over here. Russ versus Sullivan, New York Times, hold on. This might not be the right case. That's not. Well, no, it is. I can't hardly see it. Oh, well, let me tell you about New York Times versus Sullivan. You read the case. I can't read the case. It's too small on my screen. So if you read it and it makes sense about what I'm about to tell you, then good. Okay, in this case, New York Times was publishing an advertisement that the NAACP was running that was very, very much accusatory against the Birmingham police force for arresting Dr. Martin Luther King and denying writ of habeas corpus. The name of the advertisement was Let the Voices Be Heard, I believe. And Sullivan was one of the Birmingham police officers or one of the Birmingham local government officials that was criticized in this advertisement. And he sued New York Times for running the advertisement. So remember, the NAACP bought this spot in the New York Times. The New York Times agreed to run the advertisement, but they sued New York Times for allowing this to run, saying that it defamed his character. And the Supreme Court said that since public officials are bound to a higher standard in libel cases than ordinary citizens, not only do they have to show that what was printed was false, but that the media knew it was false, and it was published in a complete disregard for the truth. What New York Times did is establish this concept of actual malice. It established the principle that if you were the media, and you wrote a false statement to purposely hurt somebody's character, then it could be proven that there was actual malice, then you could get in trouble. Otherwise, just because you're critical of a public figure and you're the media, that the government can't stop you. That public official can't stop you from saying what you're going to say. Obscenity. Obscenity, by definition, is a collection of work, whether film, book, magazine, TV show, internet website, or a play with content that is sexual or perverse. That kind of material is limited. It is speech that is limited. In order to have access to obscenity, you have to be of age. There's restrictions. It can't be something that is for general public view. That was established in Miller versus California. Miller versus California, the Supreme Court had the chance to clarify how you determine what is considered obscene versus what should be there for all of public to see. So the Supreme Court had to determine what is considered pornography or obscenity versus what is considered art or scientific or political value. The standard that it set in Miller versus California, Supreme Court said that the average person, under modern standards, if they find the acts depicted in the work to be perverse, then it is. So the average person thinks it's perverse. The conduct that is depicted in the material is defined by law as offensive sexual conduct. So conduct is offensive sexual conduct by law. And the content lacks serious scientific, literary, political, or artistic value. So if there's no point to the nudity or the obscenity or the sexual perversions depicted, then it can't be shown. So that defined the whole idea of pornography and obscenity. Now, pornographic material is considered to be obscene. That's why it is limited and regulated by the government. You can have access to it, you just have to follow certain guidelines. Now, a lot of times things like artwork will get questioned of whether it's obscene or not, so then it is held to the standard that was established in Miller versus California. Other forms and speech. Look, just because you don't like what somebody is saying doesn't mean that they can't say it. But there are times that we do limit speech. One thing that we limit is fighting words. Fighting words are hates and things that are hate speech that are bound to turn violent. So it goes immediately from speech to violence. And that was established in Chaplinsky versus New Hampshire. In this case, Chaplinsky was arrested for basically calling a cop a fascist. Chaplinsky was arrested because his speech was really getting people mad at him. He was criticizing some Jehovah's Witnesses religion. The Jehovah's Witnesses were about to attack him, and the cops arrested Chaplinsky to protect him, or to kind of like get him away from where he was going. They didn't arrest him, but they tried to move him away so he wouldn't get beat up by these Jehovah's Witnesses. In that case, after he was being moved, he threatened the cop, and then the cop arrested him for what he had threatened. And then the Supreme Court said, you know what, it's fine. If words are going to incite violence, then they can be limited. What can't be limited is symbolic speech. Now, symbolic speech is different from pure speech. Pure speech is words that are spoken. Symbolic speech are actions that are carried out to convey a message. Like giving somebody the middle finger is symbolic speech. Having a bumper sticker on your car is symbolic speech. Wearing a certain t-shirt is symbolic speech. And symbolic speech is protected. Whether we like what somebody is doing or not, it's protected. Like in Texas versus Johnson, the flag burning case. We might value the American flag. In fact, we do in this country. Our political culture teaches us to revere the flag. But that doesn't mean that somebody cannot burn it in protest. Commercial speech. Commercial speech, such as advertising, is restricted far more extensively than other freedoms of expression. You can't falsely advertise. You can't try to incorrectly lure customers in to buy your products. The Federal Trade Commission, a regulatory agency, regulates that. And then, of course, all of your public airways are regulated by the FCC, the regulatory agency. The FCC regulates content, nature, and all of the radio and television broadcasting. All of radio and televisions have to be licensed stations and have to comply with certain regulations, such as the forbidding of the use of obscenity on the airways.